Here's a girl who spends her time hoping that her husband's aim stays as true as his heart. While some men throw the crockery about, Martin Collins prefers cutlery. How does it feel to be this close to the point of death? Let's see it from Elizabeth's angle. And now in slow motion.
Yes, work can sometimes feel like that. Good to see you again. And for the third and final of our Lunch and Learn sessions on stress, let's get started. Now, for some reason, you've decided to run away from Milford and join the circus. Unfortunately, the only job that they had left was the knife thrower's assistant. Yes, the knife thrower's assistant's job has come up again. But you're finding the work a little stressful. So what can you do? Well, let's go through our model and see what's going to work. So you could change the circumstance. Well, you've kind of done that. That's what got us into this. You could change the situation. You could reduce the number of shows. You could smell the knife thrower's breath and see if he's been drinking. You could get a mask. You could ask not to be spun quite so fast. You could ask the knife thrower not to ride a unicycle on the slack line. All this is helping, but you're still not quite as stress-free as you would like. So you move on to managing the response. So you stop drinking so much coffee before each show. You exercise. You eat less junk food. Actually, being thin is probably a very good idea. You've been taking breaks and you've been making sure you get a good night's sleep. Yet, despite all that, you still feel quite anxious before each show. You're finding it hard to make long-term plans. You're quite preoccupied. Well, that leaves us with the last lever. Changing our interpretation of the event. Can we face a really bad outcome, even heaven forbid, physical danger, and not feel excess stress? Are there any mental tools that we can use? The answer is yes, but this is next level stuff. It involves going inside the matrix, getting inside the machine that creates your reality and tweaking the code, changing the interpretation that is causing those intense feelings of stress. So, in this session, I want to cover just two things. The first is to remind you that stress is created inside our heads. You know that, or perhaps you know that it has to be true logically, but I want you to know it. I want you to feel how right that statement is. And the evidence I'll present is people with phobias, my own experience with depression, and free divers. Then I want to give you an idea for how we can influence that process. We aren't robots. We can't turn the process off. Well, not right away. But we can usefully turn the volume down. Let's get started. Okay, the first point. Where does stress come from? Well, it certainly feels that stress is created by something. For example, I'm feeling fine, then suddenly a pile of work comes on. Time frames get tight, and boom, I feel stressed. But the stress doesn't come through the air. We don't breathe it in. There's nothing stressy we can point to, like a line. If it feels real, it must be because it's created inside our heads, like this. Like too much work, too tight a deadline, fires off rules and beliefs wired in our subconscious. And that creates the feeling of stress. But just because it happens in our heads doesn't mean that we necessarily can control the process. Well, here's a way of finding out if we can. If only the situation causes stress, then there should be a relationship like this. With increasing danger or consequence or a bad outcome, you would expect to see increasing levels of stress. We could even try and put some stressful occupations on it. This is what Google says are stressful occupations. Where do you think fund management would go? Somewhere here? If the only level of danger or consequence, if only the level of danger caused stress, you wouldn't expect to see any people here in this top left quadrant. That is people who are facing no consequences, yet are still quite stressed. And there certainly should never be any people in this lower right box, people who are under intense pressure, who face real consequence, who don't feel stressed. Well, the thing is that you find people in both of these boxes. So looking at the first quadrant, the top left quadrant first, we often see people facing very little danger and risk, showing great fear or stress. It's called having a phobia. People can have phobias of lots of things, but a common one is spiders. But I suppose spiders can bite, so there is a bit of logic there. Less understandable is a fear of clowns. But clowns, I guess, can be evil, so there's some logic to that as well. But I think the best example are those Dutch football fans. You remember the ones that got so worked up over a penalty shootout in the European Football Cup that they had heart attacks? There was no threat to them at all. It made as much personal difference to them which team won as it would do for you and I. That stress was entirely created by themselves. Just before we leave phobias, though, I watched a very interesting documentary recently about this guy.
Dan Cash also has a fear of heights, which has left him terrified of crossing even the smallest bridge.
I know it's irrational and I know that it's just a bridge, but I freeze when I get to a bridge and I really don't like walking over them.
But after taking a new drug, he managed to completely overcome his fear so that he could start doing things like this. What made this so interesting, though, was that there was nothing in the pill. It was a placebo. That was the hook of the show, which shows that stress was being entirely created internally, and he had the power to change it, at least subconsciously. He just needed to give himself permission. Now, you might be thinking that perhaps these people with phobias don't represent a normal or a typical experience. Well, perhaps so. I would have thought that too, until something similar happened to me. I mentioned in the past how much pressure I was feeling in the preparations leading up to the transatlantic rowing race. I felt overwhelmed by the size and the number of the tasks I was taking on, and I wasn't doing that well. I felt like I was dropping the ball, and it was my fault. And we've talked about how sometimes in the middle of the night you wake up worrying about things, then in the daytime you wonder what the fuss was about. Well, one day I woke up and that feeling didn't go away. I found it very hard to get out of bed, and when I did, I just couldn't prioritize. Everything was DEFCON 9. It was like a huge weight. Everything felt impossible. There was nothing to look forward to. Everything seemed futile. If you ever do feel like this, then speaking to someone who's been through it is incredibly helpful. You know, a doctor's very good too. I was lucky enough to have a friend who had been through some episodes, and to hear her story and to find out that there was a way through this was, like I said, very helpful. So I started to take an antidepressant, and I began to feel much better, almost right away. But here's the weird thing. If you had asked me a week earlier why I felt overwhelmed, I'd have looked at you like you were nuts and then listed off the 50 things that I had to get done and the terrible consequences that would follow if I didn't get them done. As surely as a hammer hitting my thumb with a hammer, it was the pressures and the work that were causing the problem. But then I took the medicine and it didn't get me sponsorship. It didn't find me a rowing partner. The medicine didn't change my situation one bit. I had exactly the same problems before I swallowed the pill as afterwards. But prior to taking the pills, my stress levels were perhaps here. Then afterwards, they moved to here. So it wasn't the pressure that was causing my stress after all. It was my interpretation of the situation. It was what I was thinking. And I could change what I was thinking. And I'm certainly very careful now when I find myself thinking defeatist, negative thoughts, when I'm putting the boot into myself, because I know now the dark places where that kind of thinking can go. So let's now go to this lower right quadrant. People facing a high risk of a bad outcome, but who somehow manage to really usefully control their stress. So who might be in here? Well, I think any stand-up comic or any solo performing artist, like a concert pianist doing a live show, they really have to be on top of their fear, because it doesn't take too much fear before it starts affecting their performance, and that can spiral out of control. That said, comedians talk a lot about dying on stage, but they always manage to walk off it. These people sometimes don't. Free solo rock climbers like Alex Honnold, seen here climbing Half Dome in Yosemite, he climbs without any ropes or pitons, just using his hands and his feet. So he has a very interesting relationship with fear. Let's see what he says. A lot of times you should be able to put your fear aside and do exactly what you should be doing. Wow, that's great mental control. But a little bit of stress when you're climbing actually might help you. We can find a even tougher example. What about people who face tremendous physical risk but aren't even allowed one stray anxious thought? Which brings me to my personal favorite, freedivers. The aim of freediving is to go down as deep as possible in one breath and still return to the surface, still conscious. If you are still alive, when you get back to the top, you haven't gone down deep enough. And people do this for fun. Let's follow one Kiwi guy, William Trubridge's world record attempts.
William Trubridge, New Zealand, free immersion, 122 metres, 4 minutes and 30 seconds, world record attempt.
As you descend, the pressure builds up quite quickly so that your lungs compress into the size of a walnut and you start to sink into this dark abyss, which must be unsettling. The key to success is staying as absolutely as relaxed as you can. Any agitation at all is going to increase your oxygen level. At no time can you let yourself even think about whether or not you've left enough money in the parking meter. So let's stop him at the bottom here so we can have a quick chat. He says, I'm starting to feel a bit stressed. You say, why? He says, can you not see the mountain of work I have to get done? I've got to grab the stupid tag here. I've got to get back up to the top. Have you not seen the deadline? I'm under a lot of pressure here. And he's right. He's not imagining this. He really is under a lot of consequence. He has every right to be stressed. Let's see if he gets back to the top. This is the worst bit now. He's has to fight the gravity on the way up. And you're seriously running out of oxygen as you've been underwater for a couple of minutes. And apparently you can't even physically look up to the surface because the pressure creates a suction lock in your throat. And as you near the top, your lungs are often convulsing from the lack of breath. When you do break the top, you've got 15 seconds to take off your mask, make eye contact with the judges, give them an OK symbol, and say I'm OK. The mental control of freedivers is fascinating because they react to pressure so differently from us. Like I said, if they allow themselves to get even a little bit anxious, then there's every risk they would pass out before they reached the surface. So instead of thinking about all the things that might go wrong, they must be thinking about something else. But what? And can we get some of that zen in our own work lives? Well, let's imagine that you're in this situation. There's been some odd combination of things that have gone wrong. You're in the office on the weekend. There's no more levers to pull. You can't phone a friend. You can't ask the audience. A hard deadline is approaching. You have to get things done. But progress is slow. You've already walked around the block. You've been taking many breaks, but you still feel like you're at the bottom of the free dive with 100 meters of water between you and taking a normal breath again. Your stress is at an 8 and you really love it to be at a 5. You want a tool that you can use in the moment to drop your stress. Here it is. Let's look at it step by step. So first, I think it's really important to believe that you're allowed to drop your level of stress. Sometimes I wonder if we don't reject stress enough because we think we deserve it. We think there's some use in it. We think it's inevitable. Remember that guy with a fear of heights who was cured by a sugar pill? He just needed to give himself permission. And remind yourself that you can consciously lower your level of stress. Free divers do it. Free solo rock climbers. Stand-up comedians. People with spider phobias can be taken from can't stand to be in the same room as a spider to having a big spider in their hands in as little as 2 or 3 hours. And if those examples don't work for you, you can always do a little demonstration on yourself. Try answering this. Can you make your level of stress worse? Make it rise 1 point just by your thoughts alone. I bet you could. Just tell yourself you're getting short of time, that this will be really bad if you screwed up. And if you can make your stress worse, then isn't it at least possible you can make it better? Take a moment to breathe out and re-examine the situation. Throw some rocks at your beliefs. Well, much better off than free divers because they need their air and they are definitely in a dangerous situation. But we can double check if we've got our perspective right. The cool thing is we've laid the groundwork for this when we looked at dealing with setbacks a few weeks ago. The questions we asked ourselves then were, will this still be a big deal in 6 months' time? How do you know it will be a bad thing? And on average, your life will return to average. You don't want to freeze frame your thinking at the worst moment of the worst possible outcome. Talking about images, often you might not have a specific image in your head about what might go wrong. But if you did, what is the image that you would have? Sometimes when I'm stressed about an upcoming speech, that fear can be a bit shapeless. So I make a point of trying to form an image about what do I think the worst outcome will be. I suppose it's I'm being in front of the audience, I'm completely lost for words, and I'm possibly not wearing pants. Well, when I think about it like that, it's unlikely that it will go that badly. I have my notes nearby. I can get a prompt from the next slide. I'm probably going to remember to wear my pants. So next time you're stressed, grab hold of your thoughts and give them an upgrade. From this will be a disaster to this might not be quite as good as I hoped it would be. To I can't get this done, to the more I do, the better off I am. To this work is rubbish, to get something out and improve on it. You get the idea. From this might go bad to I can only do the best I can. On to the last step. Focus on the very next stroke and stop anticipating a bad outcome. That's not to say a bad outcome won't happen. There might be serious consequences. There might be tens of millions of dollars on the line. But your task is not to focus on that. When you drive along an icy, narrow mountain road, it's not helpful to keep looking at the drop. You focus on the road. You might still go off the road, but spending any time thinking about that's not going to be helpful. If you're in the Titanic and it's sinking, then focus on what you need to do to get to the queue for the lifeboats. It doesn't mean that you'll get a seat on the lifeboat, but it will give you the best chance. And that's the best you can hope for. Let's listen to what William Trubridge says. That was the free diver we saw just a moment ago. What he says about anticipating a bad outcome.
But here's the catch. You cannot in any way anticipate your arrival at that point. You have to freefall, descend with the conviction or with no expectation or point of arrival. You see, a terrestrial being would become more tense and agitated the deeper it descends. And negative thoughts, they breed like gremlin rabbits until they swarm all over your mind. Instead, you can count the strokes, give your mind something to do in the same way that you would give a baby a pacifier to suck on. 1 stroke. 2 strokes.
Give your brain something to do like you would a baby a pacifier to suck on. I love that line. So you can't not think of something. Instead, you have to focus on something else. And it's a common technique that cancer patients coping with chemotherapy or endurance athletes in long-distance sport, or any time people have to endure pain and discomfort, they do the same thing. They use a mantra. And it could be as simple as, I got this, I got this. or as complicated as this.
My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. Hello! My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. Hello! My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. No!
So what's your mantra? What pacifier are you going to give your brain? Crossing the Atlantic, when I'd feel the distance starting to get on top of me, I'd look out the back of the boat and I'd say to myself, would I rather be here or back there? These mantras work not because they're good at picking you up, but because they interrupt the thoughts that would drive you down. So here again is the method for dealing with stress in the moment when you don't have any other options. Give yourself permission. Know that you can change your stress levels. Take a moment to grab hold of your thoughts and give them a shake. Give your fears a face. What is that image? And then make sure you're not freeze-framing at the worst possible moment of the worst possible outcome. Then just focus on the next step, using a repeated phrase to give your mind something to suck on. I want to recap this week in a slightly different way. I want you to meet Mark. He's a great guy. I caught up with him for the first time since lockdown, and I asked him how his lockdown had gone, and he said he'd been under a lot of pressure. Just before the lockdown, he began a new high-powered sales job, and then he had to work from home. His wife was working in the hospital. He was left to homeschool his 3 young kids. He felt himself pulled in all different ways, with his roles as a father, as a teacher, as an employee, as a husband. He said he'd been under a lot of stress. So I asked him. I said, in terms of the stress, what did he do well? What did he do badly? And what advice would he give himself if he could go back in time? He said on the good side, because he didn't know how long lockdown would last, he focused on just getting through each day. In fact, not from each day, just task to task. He would focus on getting up, get breakfast, get one kid's school sorted, move on to the next kid, do a bit of work himself, make morning tea, and so on. Which is what we just talked about, focusing on the next stroke, on the next stroke. On what he didn't do quite so well, he said he tried to muscle it out. He didn't ask for help. We talked about that last week. He said he wouldn't do that again. He would ask for help sooner. And if he could do it again, he would have gotten some exercise. He didn't think he got any. He said he should have just gone for a walk and got some me time. He would have got some more sleep. So again, all the things that we talked about last week. He went on. Unfortunately, he didn't take any time to breathe out and check if his assumptions were right. He worried a lot about the impression he was making as a new employee. It really wasn't the one he had hoped for. He compared himself to people at work who he thought were doing much better than him, even though he knew they didn't have kids. Instead of focusing on the road, he said he spent too much time worrying on things he couldn't control. He'd been very hard on himself. He said he felt he'd been a terrible father, a terrible teacher, a terrible employee, and a terrible husband. So how did he finish the conversation? Let's do a little poll. What did he say? Based on what Mike said, how did he end the conversation? It was tough and I'm glad it's over. I got shingles and had to take a week off work. I'm kind of giving you the answer a little bit. Okay, it's going to end up being very close. I'll stop it there. So you see what actually happened. So you thought it was tough and I'm glad it's over. I got shingles and had to take off work. He got shingles. He had to take I haven't had shingles myself, but I've done some reading about it since. And it sounds incredibly painful. He had got into a lot of pain, had been taking painkillers for some time and would have to do so for months. the giveaway was the number of things that he wasn't doing well, and the negative thoughts. That was the killer. And the weird thing was, it turns out, he said he actually got it all wrong. He was actually doing a really good job keeping everyone happy. He didn't know that at the time. But now he can't get his kids to go to school because they love being with him so much. And his wife thought he was amazing holding down the fort for all those weeks. He said that he wished when he started getting the first skin rash of shingles that he'd recognized the warning sign and done something about it sooner, before it had become so bad. Which brings me to the last point that I'd like to make about making stress work for you. We've talked a lot about how to get a handle on an episode of high stress and looking how free divers and cancer patients control their brain to put a lid on unhelpful negative thoughts. And I'm conscious that when I've used a work example, it's usually been about having too much work on, but there are other triggers of stress as well, like dealing with difficult people. That's a big one. Managing unrealistic expectations, having to make big decisions with a huge impact. Some of you mentioned things like this in the survey at the end of last week. Each of these require planning and possibly learning new skills and maybe having a difficult conversation. Each of them will have their own solution, but they all require a cool and a dispassionate mind. When stress is too high, it's very hard to perform at your best. Stress above 4 or 5 is just noise. Your mood is about despair and it's all about short-term thinking. So it's useful to have the tools to get some perspective and focus and dial that stress back down. But unless you're a Buddhist monk, you won't have complete control. You're not going to be able to train your brain to live a life of no stress. I'm not even sure you'd want to. But you don't need to get your stress down to 0. If you can just dial that stress back down to 4 or 5, then you can start usefully and productive looking at ways to resolve the situation that's triggering your stress. And that, if you can do that, then you'll be making stress work for you. I hope that's been helpful. I've really enjoyed putting this course together over the last few weeks. I found it incredibly helpful for myself. Thank you for your attention and your contributions over the last few weeks. The summary pack will be available before the end of the day. I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you very, very much.